All right, I'm going to go ahead and make a start. Thanks everyone for being here. This is the inaugural session of the TalkAboutDoubts.com course, which is exclusive to Talk About Doubts past inquirers and also our team members. And what we're going to be looking at over the, this is going to be running every other Tuesday, and then of course every other Tuesday we're going to be doing the emotional support group, which some of you were at last week, which is run by our colleague Justin. And at the course, we're going to be looking at the evidences for Christianity. What positive reasons do we have to believe that Christianity is in fact true? And today, we're actually going to be covering some of the basic epistemological foundations that are necessary to give one a firm handle on how we should reason about these matters. How do we think about evidence? How do we come to rational and reasonable conclusions from an appraisal of the relevant evidence? So that's what we're going to be covering tonight. And then in the ensuing weeks, as we progress through this course, we will look at some of the specific evidences that pertain to the veracity of Christianity. We'll look at the case for the robust reliability of the Gospels and Acts. We'll look at the case for the resurrection of Jesus. We'll look at arguments from prophecy and other arguments that pertain to the veracity of Christianity. Okay, so let me just give you a little bit of information on the course format so that we can set some expectations. So I'll try to keep my remarks to approximately 4 to 5 minutes or thereabouts. And then we will open it up for Q&A and discussion, which can go on for up to perhaps 30 to 45 minutes, but could be shorter than that if there are no questions. Sometimes I might also throw in a breakout discussion if there's interesting questions that come up that I think are worth discussing in breakout rooms. And then we'll have some after hours chat after the formal close. If anyone wants to stay on further and chat further, then they are welcome to do so. So just a little bit about me. So you can find me at jonathanmcclatchy.com. There you can find many of my essays on various aspects of Christian apologetics and theology. I talk about a whole range of different topics. I talk about the case for the resurrection, New Testament reliability, the authorship of the Pauline corpus, in particular the disputed letters. I talk about predictive prophecy, in particular messianic prophecy. I interact with Orthodox Jewish objections to Jesus as the Messiah. I interact with Islam, Islamic apologetics. I discuss the Trinity and Christology and all that fun stuff. I also do stuff. I publish material on intelligent design and evidence of design, in particular in the life sciences. And I'm also interested in evidence of design in the physical sciences as well, though my PhD is in the life sciences. So that's really my area of primary expertise. And then, of course, as you all know, I'm the founder of TalkAboutDoubts.com, and my vision behind TalkAboutDoubts.com is to provide an environment where people can become exposed to the best and most robust arguments for Christianity before making a decision on whether or not to reject the Christian faith. And so I try to provide a platform where seekers and inquirers and people with doubts about their faith, and even people that have already left the faith, that can schedule private Zoom calls to talk about their doubts in confidence with someone who's an expert and has done a lot of work or research on the particular field of their inquiry. So I want to begin by talking about a growing concern that I have and is part of my heart behind the ministry of TalkAboutDoubts.com, and that is the pervasive anti-intellectualism or anti-academic attitudes that exist in modern contemporary Christendom. This is a clip from a channel on YouTube called Cordial Curiosity, which is run by a guy called Reed Nicewonder, whom I have dialogued with in the past. Nice guy. He does a practice that is known as street epistemology, which is a practice that has become very popular in atheist circles. It was pioneered by a guy called Peter Boghossian. And probably the best known street epistemologist these days is a guy called Anthony Magnabosco, who also has a popular YouTube channel And Read Nice Wonder also has a very successful channel. And basically, street epistemology is the practice of asking Socratic questions to get people to question the validity of the methods they use to arrive at conclusions and beliefs about the world. And this particular clip that we're going to watch is a clip where Read Nice Wonder, or Cordial Curiosity, is in dialogue with a Christian girl called Tia. And let's listen to how that dialogue progresses.
Does just believing in something make that something true?
No.
Okay.
Just because you believe in Santa doesn't mean he's true. I mean, doesn't make it true. But
okay. So yeah, like just believing in a God doesn't make it true, right?
Not unless you truly know.
Unless you truly know. How could we know?
I think it's just faith, going back to faith.
It's just faith?
It's not, yeah. That's what I believe, having faith.
Is there evidence for a God?
Mm-hmm.
What's the best one?
There's a lot. Like I said, there's a lot. I have to think, but you're putting me on the spot. It's hard.
If all of that evidence, I'm not saying it's not true, that evidence, but if all that evidence was found to be not reliable, would that change your confidence that the God is real?
No.
So it's not
it really wouldn't.
So it's not really about evidence either?
No, it's just about faith.
And faith is just belief? If someone from another religion came up to the table and said that believing in their God gave them joy and that they have really good internal feelings about that God, is that a justifiable way to come to that belief just by going off feelings for that?
No. I would say that's awesome. I would say that's cool, but check out what I have to say. Yeah. Check out.
If it's not reliable for them, why was it reliable for yourself?
You're asking tough questions. You really are. You're doing good. It's not. I'm not saying it's reliable. It's not. But it's just what I believe personally, and I always will believe it. I just have a very strong faith towards it.
Is just believing or having faith in anything a reliable way to have confidence that something's true?
I think faith.
Why?
Because it's... You're good at this.
I'm just very interested in why people believe.
It's asking me tough questions. I didn't even learn this in Bible class. Or I slept through it.
And this is a representative sample of a phenomenon that you see if you go and review any of these street epistemology videos. You can find thousands upon thousands of these on YouTube, and you can find that invariably Christians are underprepared, to put it mildly, to answer even the most basic objections and questions that might be raised in regards to their faith. You might think, of course, that, well, perhaps pastors are going to be more prepared to engage with such basic questioning. Well, here's a short clip from a well-known atheist TV program called The Atheist Experience, which is based out of Austin, Texas. And here we see Matt Dillahunty and Don Baker interact with a pastor about questions that he has concerning his faith. About questions that he has concerning faith and atheism. I believe that this pastor's brother had become an atheist, having listened to Matt Dillahunty and Don Baker in the past.
My brother called a few months ago and was completely convinced by you guys and loves you guys. Has been making me watch your videos. And I'm a pastor of a small little church here in Chicago, and he's been begging me to call.
So you disagree because you're convinced, probably because of Romans 1, that everybody knows that God exists.
Yes.
Yeah. Why do you believe Romans 1?
Because it's the Bible.
Okay, why do you believe the Bible?
I wasn't necessarily prepared for that particular question.
You're a preacher and you're not prepared for a question on why you believe the Bible? I'm not trying to be rude. This to me is like the basics.
And so it shouldn't come as any surprise that many individuals who were once identifying as Christians are leaving the faith in droves when they are so underprepared to engage with even the most basic questions. I mean, this is elementary. Why do you believe the Bible? And it's really quite alarming that so few people in contemporary Christendom are prepared to address that sort of question. Why, though, should we settle for a blind belief? You know, the Bible is a big book. It's written over some 1,500 years, and it intersects with independently documented events in the real world thousands of times. The answer to the question of whether Christianity is true, therefore, ought to be discernible from the evidence if one is prepared to invest the requisite work. We have an embarrassment of riches of data to explore. Why then do so many blindly decide the answer to that question without so much as bothering to do their due diligence and research the evidence pertaining to the veracity of Christianity? Isn't it important to know whether Christianity is true or not? And if Christianity were false, I would want to know that so that I could deconvert, because I want to align my beliefs with what is true of reality. And so if it's important to us to believe true things and to believe as many true things as possible and as few false things as possible, then we really owe it to ourselves to investigate the evidence, both pro and con, to come to an honest and fair and balanced assessment of where the evidence points. Now, what is apologetics? What do we mean when we talk about apologetics? Well, as many of you know, the word apologetics is derived from the Greek word apologia, which means, it's a legal term, means to give a defense of your position. It's used, for instance, in 1 Peter 3:15, where we're instructed to be prepared to give an apologia, an apologetic, to everyone who asks us to give the reason for the hope that lies within us. Doing so with gentleness and respect. And it's a discipline, apologetics is a discipline of offering a reasonable defense of our position. And now it's important, though, not only to state what apologetics positively is, but also to contrast it with what it is not. Now, apologetics is not an end in itself. It's apologetics is not the end goal. The end goal is assuming Christianity to be true, which I think is well justified by the evidence, as hopefully we'll see throughout this course. The end goal is to encourage people to form relationships with Christ and to enter into communion with Christ, to clear away stumbling blocks that stand in their way so that they can believe the gospel and commit their lives to it and live in accordance with it. Apologetics is sometimes misrepresented as being contrary to open-ended inquiry. And I often see people sometimes distancing themselves from apologetics or saying things like, Richard Carrier, for example, says this all the time, that that's apologetics, not history. And I think that's a false dichotomy. Apologetics is not contrary to open-ended inquiry. It's not the same thing as open-ended inquiry, but it is coextensive with it. And what I mean by that is that apologetics is what happens after the results of the open-ended inquiry are in, and the time has come to publish one's data and one's interpretation of the data and try to persuade others of the truth of their conclusion, the truth of the conclusion that one has come to based upon the findings that one has observed. And so Charles Darwin, for example, in 1859, when he published The Origin of Species, that is, I would argue by this definition, an exercise in apologetics, because he's conducted his open-ended inquiry, he's come to a conclusion, and now he's publishing the results of his research, trying to persuade others that his interpretation of the data is the best one. It's not the call of the apologist, I would argue, to assume the role of a defense attorney, being committed to defending the veracity of his or her position come what may, where the belief, in this case Christianity, is the client, and one is just committed to defending that position regardless of what arguments might be brought to bear. Rather, the apologist should assume the role of an investigative journalist, reporting for popular consumption the results of a fair and balanced inquiry. And so I think it's important that we try to objectively inform as much as possible people with whom we are engaging. People are made aware both of the evidence for and the evidence against, and they are permitted to make their own assessment of where the balance of evidence rests. And in my judgment, the evidence for Christianity is stronger significantly than the evidence against. So Thomas Chalmers, in his The Evidence and Authority of the Christian Revelation, he says that reason can judge of the external evidences for Christianity because it can discern the merits of human testimony, and it can perceive the truth or the falsehood of such obvious credentials as the performance of a miracle or the fulfillment of a prophecy. So that's the open-ended inquiry. But after we've established Christianity to be an authentic message from God, upon those historical grounds on which the reason and experience of men entitle him to form his conclusions, nothing remains for us but an unconditional surrender of the mind to the subject of the message. We have a right to sit in judgment over the credentials of heaven's ambassador, but we have no right to sit in judgment over the information he gives us, right? So we conduct an open-ended inquiry as to whether this really is revelation from God, whether God really has revealed himself in the person of Jesus Christ. And if that turns out to be the case, then we make our unconditional surrender of the mind to the subject of the message. I want to draw our attention at this point to an excellent book that that's been a great influence on my own thinking. This is written by a lady called Julia Galef, whom you see pictured there on the right. And the book is called The Scout Mindset. And in The Scout Mindset, and I highly recommend this book, by the way, I actually have a book review on my website where I summarize the Scout Mindset and talk about some of the practical tips that we as Christian apologists can draw from the Scout Mindset. Highly recommend it if you haven't read it already. But basically, she distinguishes between two sorts of mindset. There is the soldier mindset, and the soldier is out to defend his team, if you will. He's out to defend his territory, his turf, come what may. And the soldier you can think of as like the criminal defense attorney. He's out to defend his client, and the belief is the client that he is there to defend. In contradistinction to that, there's also what Julia Galef calls the scout mindset. And the scout is out to discover how the world really is. And yes, he might have a preference for how the world might be. As a scout in the military, he prefers that what he discovers is most conducive to his side being victorious. But above all, he really wants to discover how the world really is so that they can make good decisions. And all of us have a certain amount of soldier mindset, and all of us have a certain level of scout mindset. And I think that it is incumbent upon us to try to maximize our scout mindset and minimize our soldier mindset. And the more that we can be like the scout, the more likely we are to come to and arrive at true conclusions as opposed to false ones. And above all, our objective should be to maximize the true beliefs that we hold and minimize our false ones. Now, another caveat I want to add concerning the discipline of Christian apologetics is that being a Christian apologist does not mean that we have all the answers. We all have questions. There are plenty of questions that I don't have an answer to, and that's okay. We don't need to have all the answers. I would distinguish actually between what's called I would distinguish between a question and an objection. Not all questions are objections. Questions might express an objection, but for a question to become an objection, you need an additional premise. Either that we don't know the answer, and if Christianity were true, we should expect to, or we do know the answer, and it entails some sort of internal incoherence or is at odds with empirical data. Short of that additional premise, a question is only a question, and it's okay to have unanswered questions. Everyone, irrespective of worldview, has unanswered questions. So it's not a big deal if we don't have the answers to all questions. It's not even a big deal if we don't necessarily have answers to all objections either. And this leads me to my next point, which is that apologetics does not entail the position that there is no evidence that tends to disconfirm Christianity. I often counsel people that if you encounter someone who takes a position on really anything, any complex topic, whether that be Christianity or evolution or climate change or vaccine efficacy and risk, or whatever it happens to be, any complex topic, if you encounter someone who tells you that all of the evidence confirms their position and there's no evidence on the other side, that's a major red flag that this person is, the confirmation bias is a major thing in this person's thinking, is a major factor in that person's thinking. So apologetics does not entail the position that there's no evidence that tends to disconfirm Christianity. It's as with all complex topics, there's evidence both for and against Christianity. Rather, it is my assessment that the evidence for Christianity is significantly stronger than the evidence against it. And so even though I concede the existence of evidence against Christianity and try to make people aware of that as I have time to do so, I make it clear that I think that the evidence on balance is strongly favorable to Christianity rather than the contrary. And so Christianity, in my judgment, is strongly justified. And so evidence for Christianity provides an indirect reason to think that there is some plausible explanation for the evidence that seems to count against it. Of course, if we had infinite knowledge, if we had exhaustive knowledge, then all of the evidence would be seen with one accord to point decisively in the direction of truth. But since we lack exhaustive knowledge, the evidence is messier than it would otherwise be if we had exhaustive knowledge. So how should we think, though, about evidence when we are approaching topics like investigating Christianity? Well, there's a popular misconception that evidence is all or nothing, or binary. That is to say that it either fully demonstrates the conclusion or it doesn't count for anything. And I would want to argue instead that there's no silver bullet, there's no single argument which is sufficient to justify Christian belief. Rather, the case for Christianity is cumulative in nature. And there's a very common mistake that people on both sides of the theism-atheism divide make, which is to evaluate each of the individual arguments individually rather than in aggregate. So, for example, take the arguments bearing on the existence of God, such as the cosmological argument, the fine-tuning argument, the argument from biological design, and so forth. A common mistake that an atheist will make is to evaluate the cosmological argument, find it to be inconclusive, move on to the fine-tuning argument, find it to be inconclusive, perhaps there's a multiverse or something like that, and so forth. And without pausing to consider whether, even if the individual arguments are insufficient to justify theistic belief, perhaps the arguments in aggregate are conclusive. So, for instance, I'm of the view that the cosmological argument, which is to say that the universe, as far as we can tell, seems to have had a beginning, and things which have a beginning tend to require an independent external cause for their existence. And so the fact that the universe had a beginning points to the universe having an external independent cause. And I'm of the position that that argument, though it provides evidence for theism, is not sufficient to justify theism, but it does nonetheless raise the probability of theism relative to what it would have been otherwise. And so I would factor that argument into a broader cumulative case for theism. So that's important to bear in mind as we think about evidence. It's still useful for an argument if it takes the probability from, say, 10% credence in theism or Christianity to 15% or to 20%, because you might have other arguments which take the evidence, take the probability yet further towards being greater than 50%. What can be accomplished by a single spectacular piece of evidence can, in principle, be achieved with numerous weaker pieces of evidence. And this is seen all the time in criminal trials, for example, where you might have lots of small pieces of evidence which are not by themselves of particular significance, and you could come up with some alternative explanation to explain how that evidence came to be. But when you have lots of different lines of evidence that all seem to point in that direction, then you have to scotch tape together a lot of independent hypotheses to try and explain the data, when really just one hypothesis would do the trick, which was the defendant is guilty. And so we favor the simpler explanation that the defendant is guilty, rather than trying to scotch tape together lots of different explanations for all of the different pieces of evidence. Now, how do we define evidence, though? So let's imagine a court scene, and the forensic expert witness comes forward and he presents the evidence of the murder weapon, which contains the fingerprints of the accused on the handle of the murder weapon. Now, the presence of the accused's fingerprints on the murder weapon is evidence for the guilt hypothesis. Doesn't necessarily prove the guilt hypothesis, but it provides evidence for the guilt hypothesis because it is more probable given the hypothesis of guilt than it would be given the hypothesis of non-guilt, right? And so even if it's not sufficient to justify belief that the defendant is guilty, it does move the needle in that direction. And there might be other evidences as well which move the needle yet further. And so that is how we ought to conceive of, I would argue, evidence. Now, how does a cumulative case work mathematically? So this is the only slide in this presentation where I'll give you a little bit of math. It's not particularly complex math, but this will help to illustrate mathematically or express mathematically how a cumulative case works. So suppose that this simply means that the probability of the evidence given the hypothesis is 0.2, but the probability of the evidence given the falsity of the hypothesis is 0.04. Well, then the ratio in that case of the probability of the evidence given the hypothesis against the probability of that same evidence given the falsity of the hypothesis has the value of 5 to 1. So it expresses a likelihood ratio, or just 5. This is known as the Bayes factor in probability theory. Now, five such pieces of evidence would yield a cumulative ratio of 3,125 to 1. So that's 5 times 5 times 5 times 5 times 5, because the evidence is the strength of the evidence is multiply together. So if the initial ratio were 2 to 1, 10 pieces of independent evidence, that's 2 times 2 times 2 times 2, all the way up to 10 times, would have a cumulative power of more than 1,000 to 1. And so you can see that small pieces of evidence, no single piece by itself of very great weight, can combine to create a massive cumulative case. And our intuitions are actually not very good at estimating the strength of lots of different little pieces of evidences multiplied together. But when you express it mathematically, you can see just how quickly these lines of evidences mount up and become a very, very overwhelming cumulative case very, very quickly. What does the Bible have to say, though, about apologetic methodology and how we defend the veracity of Christianity? Well, I would argue that the Bible actually prescribes an evidentialist epistemology. So, for example, we see in the Old Testament, in the Pentateuch, in Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 21 and 22, this is when Moses is talking about how you recognize a true prophet from a false one. He says, if you say in your heart, how may we know the word that the Lord has not spoken? When a prophet speaks in the name of the Lord, if the word does not come to pass or come true, that is a word that the Lord has not spoken. The prophet has spoken it presumptuously. You need not be afraid of him. In other words, you discern a true prophet from a false one by the track record that that prophet has in forecasting the future. If they do it consistently, then they can be considered a true prophet. If they are unable to forecast the future, then they've spoken presumptuously. Another example in the Old Testament from Isaiah 41, set forth your case, says the Lord. Bring your proofs, says the King of Jacob. Let them bring them and tell us what is to happen. Tell us the former things, what they are, that we may consider them, that we may know their outcome, or declare to us the things to come. Tell us what is to come hereafter, that we may know that you are gods. Do good or do harm, that we may be dismayed and terrified. Behold, you are nothing, and your work is less than nothing. An abomination is he who chooses you. Or let's take the New Testament in Matthew chapter 11. This is when John the Baptist is in prison and he's heard that he's concerned about whether Jesus really is the Messiah that they've been expecting, or whether they should be waiting for another. So he sends disciples to Jesus to ask him, are you the one who is to come, or shall we look for another? And then in verse 4, Jesus answers them, go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, and the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear, and the dead are raised up, and the poor have good news preached to them, and blessed is the one who is not offended by me. So here we see that miracles are used as signs to authenticate the messianic credentials of Jesus of Nazareth, and therefore provide evidence for that conclusion. Now, having established then what we mean by evidence and what we mean by apologetics, another popular misconception that we need to clarify is what is meant by faith. And as many of you are aware, there's a very popular misconception in our culture that faith is the belief in something without a shred of evidence whatsoever, and that it's actually a vice to have faith, because why would anyone want to believe anything without having any reasons to do so, without having any evidence? And we sometimes hear people talk about how a belief requires faith or something like that. And I think that's a mistaken way to think about faith. Rather, faith, I would argue, is the firm reliance on the character or ability of a person or thing, ideally based on good reasons. And so I think it's a mistake to talk about a belief requiring faith. Rather, faith is either justified or it's not justified for a particular belief. And the more evidence I have to justify a belief, the more inclined I am to exercise faith in that proposition to which I have already intellectually assented. In the same way that if I step on an airplane, I am exercising confidence in the engineering and in the pilot to get me safely to my destination. Is one thing to be intellectually persuaded of that, but actually getting on the airplane is an expression of faith. And the more confident I am in the engineering of the airplanes and the statistics and so forth, the more inclined I am to exercise faith by actually getting on board the airplane. Now, in a popular objection to this idea is Hebrews 11:1, where the writer of Hebrews says, "Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen." And so it's sometimes argued that this text teaches fideism, the idea that we should believe things in the absence of evidence. And I don't think this is what Hebrews 11:1 is getting at. In fact, I think it's saying the very opposite. What the author of Hebrews is saying, if you look at the context, you'll see this, I think, quite quickly, is that faith is trusting God with his future as yet unrealized promises in view of his past faithfulness. So it's analogous to how a man might exercise faith in his wife on his wedding day as they make their vows to one another. And in doing so, he exercises confidence in his wife's fulfillment of her wedding vows, not because he's seen her perform the wedding vows, because it's yet future, it hasn't happened yet, but because of his observation of her past faithfulness, and therefore he trusts her with her future as yet unrealized promises that he has not seen yet. And so again, the evidence of past faithfulness is itself evidence that justifies faith or confidence. In fact, the word confidence and confide actually come from the Latin confides, literally with faith. Now, what about doubting Thomas? It's another popular example. So in John 20, verse 29, it says, Jesus said to Thomas, after Thomas is requested to see the prints of the nails that went through Jesus' hands and feet and the print of the spear that went through Jesus' side. And Jesus says to him, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." And I think, first of all, if you continue reading in John chapter 20, we discover that John, the author, tells us that Jesus did many other things which are not written, but these things are written that you might believe that Jesus is Christ and thus have life in his name. And so the signs are written up as evidence for us. And of course, Jesus elsewhere, as I've argued previously, promotes and encourages evidentialism. He talks about the resurrection, other miraculous signs as authentication of his messianic and divine self-claims. He appeals to messianic prophecy and various other things. And so Jesus, I would argue, is an evidentialist. Now, how, though, do we understand this text in John 20, verse 29? Well, I think a very reasonable interpretation here is that Jesus is chiding Thomas for having not believed, even though he had already been given sufficient evidence. He had been with Jesus. He'd observed the miracles during Jesus' ministry. He had testimony of Jesus' resurrection from these other individuals who had witnessed Jesus being raised from the dead. And so he had what ought to have been reasonable justification for believing in Jesus' resurrection, and thus, but he had demanded more than what ought to have been sufficient evidence. And so that, I think, is what Jesus is chiding Thomas for. God doesn't tend to take very well to us demanding more evidence than what ought to be rationally sufficient. By the way, also in Acts 17, when Paul is preaching in Athens, and he says that he talks about how God has raised Jesus from God has said today, when he will judge the world by the man he's appointed, he has given assurance of this to all by raising him from the dead. The word that we translate assurance there is actually the accusative form of the Greek word pistis, or faith. And so literally, God has given faith to all men by raising him from the dead, or assurance or confidence of this. And so again, pointing to the evidential character of faith. Now, a popular objection to the arguments for miracles is this idea that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. A very popular slogan in atheist circles, and this is a quote from the late astronomer Carl Sagan, who is a popularizer of astronomy and a very prominent astrophysicist, and but the idea that he's expressing here really goes back to the Scottish philosopher David Hume, who makes this objection to miracles. He says, and I quote, "I flatter myself that I so he's giving he's talking about how strong an argument he thinks this is. He says, I flatter myself that I have discovered an argument which, if just, will, with the wise and learned, be an everlasting check to all kinds of superstitious delusion, and consequently will be useful as long as the world endures." And so you can see that he was a very humble individual, or not. Well, what is the thesis that David Hume is putting forward? Well, he says that no testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle unless the testimony be of such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the fact which it endeavors to establish. And so really the argument is that it's not so much an argument against the possibility of miracles, it's more an argument against the ability to justify belief in miracles, because miracles by their very nature deviate from the normal course of nature. And so according to the argument, miracles are the very least likely explanation. Otherwise there wouldn't be a miracle. And so you can't really infer a miracle as the best explanation of events in the remote past, because a miracle by its very nature has to be the least plausible or least probable explanation. That's what it means to be a miracle, deviating from the way nature normally behaves, from natural law. Here's a contemporary statement of this argument from our old friend, Dr. Bart Ehrman. This is from a debate with Michael Licona, which took place at Southern Evangelical Seminary.
What are miracles? Miracles, by definition, are the least probable occurrence of an event. If a miracle was not least probable, it wouldn't be a miracle. If somebody could walk across the lukewarm water in your swimming pool, that would be a miracle. If the water was frozen, it would not be a miracle. But if it's lukewarm, I can tell you, none of you here could do it, and nobody in this world could do it. That's 6 billion people, so what are the chances of one person being able to do it? It would defy the way nature naturally works. I'm not saying that there are natural laws that are written down someplace that you can't break or you get in big trouble, Scientists today don't talk about natural laws, but scientists do talk about highly predictable ways that this world works. And one of the way it works is that if you are a sentient human being trying to walk across the lukewarm water in your swimming pool, you won't be able to do it. What if somebody could do it? What would be the chances? The chances would be infinitesimally remote that anybody could do it. Well, what if somebody could? Okay, let's say somebody could. The chances of them being able to do it are infinitesimally remote. Can you prove that this person probably did it? No, you can't prove it because you can't repeat the experiment of the past to show he did it. That's the problem with history. It's not like the natural sciences. The natural sciences work by repeated demonstration. And so, for example, if I wanted to show you that bars of iron will sink in that swimming pool and bars of ivory soap will float, all I need to do is to get 100 bars of both and start chucking them in. I'll chuck in 100 bars of iron, they'll sink every time. I'll chuck in the soap, they'll float every time. That gives us a predictive probability of what will happen the 101st time. That's how sciences work, by repeated experimentation. Historians don't have that luxury. Historians can only establish on the basis of surviving evidence what probably happened in the past, and by definition, miracles are the least probable occurrence, or else they're not a miracle. This creates the dilemma for the historian and is the reason why historians cannot prove Jesus was raised from the dead. Historians, by their very nature, establish what most probably happened in the past, but a miracle, by its definition, is the least probable occurrence in the past. The least probable occurrence cannot be most probable. This is the problem with the resurrection. Even if it happened, it defies imagination and cannot be accepted as a historically proven event. Belief in the resurrection. If you believe in the resurrection, it is for theological reasons. The resurrection is a theological assertion about what God did to Jesus. It is not, and it cannot be, based on historical proof. Thank you.
Right. So how would we respond to this particular point? Well, Charles Babbage puts it like this. If independent witnesses can be found who speak the truth more frequently than falsehood, it is always possible to assign a number of independent witnesses. The improbability of the falsehood of his occurrence, whose concurring testimonies, should be greater than that of the probability of the miracle itself. A question that I like to ask people who make that sort of argument is, would you say that testimony to a miracle constitutes no evidence for a miracle, or would you merely say that it constitutes insufficient evidence? And if you do think that it has non-zero evidential value, so it does have some evidential value, then necessarily it follows that there is a certain threshold of quantity and quality of testimonial data, which would be sufficient to overcome the intrinsic improbability of the miracle itself. And so you can, in principle, establish a miracle if you have sufficient quantity and quality of testimony to justify belief that the miracle has taken place. So that's the first point, that it necessarily follows, because witness testimony is a form of evidence. I mean, the hypothesis that a miracle has taken place renders it more likely than it was previously that the testimony will exist. And therefore, when you discover that there is in fact testimony of the miracle, that tends to raise the probability that the miracle has occurred. And if you have enough of that testimony, that could be, in principle, sufficient to justify belief that the miracle has taken place. Now, let's address the contention that it is a problem that miracles deviate from natural law. Now, the concept of miracles in both the Old and New Testaments is that they were to function as authenticating signs, serving as evidence, confirming the special divine appointment of a messenger. So in the Old Testament, the Hebrews were to evaluate whether a prophetic claimant spoke from God by his accuracy in forecasting the future, as we already saw in Deuteronomy 18. In the New Testament, miraculous signs were used to confirm the messianic and divine identity of Jesus and the credentials of the apostles. You see, for instance, Paul is said in 2 Corinthians 12, verse 12, to have performed the signs of an apostle in the midst of the Corinthian church. But for miracles to function in that way, to then grab our attention, they need to stand out against a regular natural order. In other words, it is necessary that they deviate from the normal course of nature. If they didn't, they would lose their evidential value as authenticating signs. Now, deviation from the physical regularities, therefore, is hardly a useful consideration in determining the prior or the intrinsic probability of a miraculous occurrence such as the resurrection. The prior probability just relates to the probability of the hypothesis given just the background information alone. And so if the hypothesis in question, namely that God has wrought miracles in history as authenticating signs, predicts with a high likelihood that these miracles are going to deviate from the natural course of nature in order to grab our attention, then the fact that they do, in fact, deviate from the normal course of nature can hardly be used as a grave blow against the hypothesis under consideration. So that's another problem with that particular rejoinder. Another consideration that Tim McGrew has given is that, so he gives this counterexample that in nuclear physics, one theory is that protons spontaneously decay. Now, it's supposed to be an extraordinarily rare event to such an extent that we've never observed it happening. But nonetheless, scientists who are convinced on theoretical grounds that spontaneous nuclear decay, spontaneous proton decay rather, is possible, they've built underground water tanks and so forth to try and detect this occurrence. But simply the fact that it's never been observed before is not a reason to preclude evidence. We can, of course, justify things that have not been observed before if we have sufficient data to justify that belief. Okay, so how do we go about assessing the prior or the intrinsic probability of Jesus' resurrection? Well, it may be conceded that the prior probability of someone rising from the dead, even granting the supposition that God exists, is extremely small, right? Even granting that God exists, God doesn't seem to be in the business of raising people from the dead. So the prior probability, the intrinsic probability of just some miscellaneous Joe Blow rising from the dead, even granting that God exists, is extremely small. However, it doesn't necessarily follow that the prior probability of God raising Jesus specifically from the dead is equivalently small, because you might have independent considerations to bear that suggest that God has plausible motivations for raising Jesus specifically from the dead. And I would actually argue this is the case. And we will get into some of these lines of argument, these independent grounds in due course as we continue on through our course. That would include considerations like the trilemma argument developed by C.S. Lewis, which I think could be developed robustly, the argument for messianic prophecy, the argument for the confession of the Apostle Paul, and so forth. So here's basically, I'll finish with this. This is an overview of my argument for Christianity, and we'll unpack and flesh out the details in subsequent weeks. So I would contend that an avalanche of varied cumulative evidence demonstrates that the Gospels and Acts are based on the testimony of eyewitnesses and that they're substantially trustworthy. That is to say that the authors of the Gospels and Acts are close up to the facts, they're well-informed, and they're habitually scrupulous. Now, a common objection here is that demonstration of mundane events in the Gospels doesn't provide support for the miraculous claims of the Gospels. And strictly speaking, sure, there's no logical progression from demonstration of the mundane events in the Gospels to demonstration of the miraculous or supernatural aspects of the biblical accounts. However, I would argue that so the way that I would develop the case for the resurrection would be to point out that if the Gospels and Acts really do represent the testimony of credible eyewitnesses, individuals who are well-informed and close up to the facts, then we can reasonably infer that the claims in the Gospels and Acts concerning the nature and variety of the resurrection encounters with the risen Jesus actually reflect what was being asserted by those who were purportedly eyewitnesses of Jesus' resurrection, including its multi-sensory nature involving multiple sensory modes, not just individual sightings at a distance and very briefly, but rather group sightings, group conversations with Jesus, physical contact with Jesus, long discourses with Jesus, observing Jesus eating broiled fish in Luke 24, eating breakfast with Jesus in the shore of the Sea of Galilee, according to John 21. According to Acts 1, it's extending across a 40-day time period, so it's not just a brief and confusing episode, and so forth. It's the sort of testimony, set of testimonies that's very difficult to be honestly mistaken about. And when anyone makes any sort of testimonial claim, there are three and only three broad categories of explanation. And this applies to sexual assault allegations or witness to a miracle, whatever it happens to be. And those three broad categories are the claimant is correct, or they're honestly mistaken, or they're lying. And the nature and variety of the resurrection encounters claimed by the Gospels is very difficult to explain on the hypothesis of them being honestly mistaken because of the detailed nature of them. And the polymodal multisensory character of the resurrection encounters. And then you look at the circumstances of the resurrection claim, and we discover that the early apostles were willing to voluntarily endure and undergo sufferings and labors and dangers and hardships and persecutions and in some cases martyrdom on account of their testimony that Christ was raised from the dead. And that is that goes a long way to establishing their sincerity in making that claim. And so that tends to support, I think, very powerfully the hypothesis that God raised Jesus from the dead as being the best explanation of the data under consideration. So that's the argument for the resurrection in a nutshell. We'll go into a lot more detail on that as we progress in subsequent weeks. Another argument I would put forward is the trilemma argument, which argues that there is very compelling evidence, we'll talk about that in subsequent weeks as well, that establish with a high level of confidence that Jesus actually claimed divine status. That being the case, one of two things is true. Either he was God or he wasn't. And if he wasn't, either we knew he wasn't or he didn't. And the fact that Jesus is willing to get himself crucified on account of that testimony that he is of divine status is goes a long way to establishing his sincerity in holding that belief. And there's a very small reference class of individuals who can be honestly mistaken about being the creator of the universe and the God of Israel incarnate, and so forth. And Jesus doesn't seem to fit that reference class. And you see that Jesus has quite a humble demeanor in washing the disciples' feet and so forth. And so even if that argument is not sufficient on its own to justify Christian belief, it does tend to move the needle in that direction. Another argument would be messianic prophecy. And we'll talk in a lot more detail about this also in subsequent weeks. But basically, an example of messianic prophecy would be that, so Isaiah 53 verses 1 and 2 tell us that the Messiah was supposed to be rejected by his own people. And yet, according to Isaiah 42:6 and Isaiah 49:6, the Messiah was nonetheless to bring representatives of all nations to recognize the God of Israel. Now, what are the odds that one messianic claimant who's rejected by his own people would nonetheless bring representatives of all nations to recognize the God of Israel? On the hypothesis that Jesus is the Messiah, that's a very high probability, approaching 1. On the hypothesis that he's not the Messiah, that's rather quite surprising. So tends to move the needle in the direction of Jesus' messianic identity. The fact Jesus was born in Bethlehem in fulfillment of Micah 5 verse 2, and we'll talk about the evidence for that when we get there too, that Jesus really was born in Bethlehem. The fact that Jesus is killed on the eve of, on the day of Passover on Nisan 15th, which is significant because Jesus is supposed to be the fulfillment of the Passover lamb imagery. The Passover relates to the last of the 10 plagues when the Egyptians, when God, the angel of death, struck down the firstborn of every Egyptian household, and when the angel of death saw the blood of the lamb that was smeared on the doorpost of the Israelite households, he passed over those homes. And so Christ becomes the fulfillment of the Passover imagery. And so it's quite befitting then that he should die by crucifixion on the day of Passover, which, given the theological import of that, I think is of evidential value. And so you can develop that case also as a cumulative one. The argument from the conversion of Paul, I would argue that the description given in Acts 9 concerning Paul's conversion actually reflects Paul's own testimony, and I'll talk about the evidence for that in a subsequent week. And that being the case, Paul seems to be sincere in holding this belief. You can read, we have multiple independent witnesses, including his own testimony, concerning his persecution, his sufferings, in particular in 2 Corinthians 12, where he gives a laundry list of many of his sufferings, as well as other letters that Paul wrote. You can find it by witness of Paul in Acts, which was written by a traveling companion of Paul, namely Luke. You can find it in Clement of Rome, who is also someone who knew Paul personally, and so on. So Paul seems to be sincere, and I think that Paul's experience, though not as veridical as that of the other apostles, is nonetheless veridical and therefore of evidential value. And it seems to be it was multi-sensory, not only a visual component, also an audible component. It seems to have affected in a sensory way the individuals who were around him as well, traveling with him. He was also blinded and healed by Ananias. So again, it's of evidential value in confirming Christianity. The art from contemporary miracles. Craig Keener has done some great work on this in his 2-volume set on the topic of miracles, as has Robert Larmer. Lee Strobel has a good book called The Case for Miracles as well, documenting examples of contemporary miracles. And not all of those are credible or equally well documented, but there are enough of them that are credible that convinces me that there's something to that argument. And we'll talk about examples of that when we get to that point in the course. And then finally, the argument from the survival of the nation of Israel against all odds. Again, this is not a sufficient argument on its own, but I do think that it is of evidential value. On the hypothesis that the God of Israel exists, it's highly probable that the nation of Israel would survive. But on the falsity of that hypothesis is rather quite surprising. I mean, you think of the survival of the nation of Israel through the Assyrian siege, and then the Babylonian conquest and exile, and through the Alexander the Great and the tyrant, the Seleucid tyrant Antiochus Epiphanes, and during the days of Judah Maccabee, who led a revolt against Antiochus. You've got the even though Judah Maccabee and his men were completely outnumbered and outgunned, you've got the siege of Jerusalem, culminating in the sacking of Jerusalem and destruction of the temple in AD 70 and the dispersal of the Jewish people. You've got the Nazi Holocaust, of course, in the 1940s. And so through all of those trials and attempts to stamp out the Jewish people have nonetheless retained their national identity. And of course, in 1948, the nation of Israel was reestablished. Now, that again is not sufficient evidence on its own to justify belief in the God of Israel. But again, it is more probable that that would happen on the hypothesis that the God of Israel exists than it is on its falsehood. So that's basically an overview of the cumulative case for Christianity that I would develop in a nutshell. And we'll consider this in a lot more detail in subsequent weeks. But that's my prepared remarks, and I'm happy to entertain any questions or comments or pushback on anything I've said. Feel free to ask any critical questions or disagree with me on anything that I have said.